Hi, I'm Jim.
And I'm Jeff. Jim, I know you've been revisiting some Bernie Glassman recordings lately. What stood out for you this time?
Well, what surprised me wasn't learning something new about his biography. What really landed this time was how deeply rooted Bernie was in what we now call the three tenets of not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action.
That's an important distinction. It's not that the tenets were a framework he applied later. They were already functioning as a way of life.
Exactly. Listening now, I hear how not knowing wasn't a teaching point for him. It was how he entered situations, without certainty, without needing to be right, and without rushing towards solutions.
And that kind of not knowing creates a very different kind of practice. It loosens our attachment to roles, status, and answers, and it makes room for real encounter.
Which is where bearing witness comes in. Bernie kept placing himself at the edges, between street and sangha, between economic classes, between people with power and people who are largely unseen. He didn't abstract suffering, he stayed with it.
And that's where his practice crossed social castes in a real way. He wasn't bridging those worlds symbolically. He was living in the tension between them, letting those encounters change him.
What feels so clear now is that taking action only came after that. Not from strategy, not from ideology, but from presence, from being willing to stay long enough for something honest to really arise.
Which is why his actions didn't look like campaigns or solutions. They looked like responses. Feeding people, creating work for people, remembering lives, standing alongside suffering rather than trying to fix it from a distance.
Yes. And listening now, it feels less like Bernie is explaining his legacy and more like he's quietly revealing how a life shaped by the three tenets actually unfolds.
So the invitation for listeners, for us, isn't to understand Bernie better as a figure, but to notice where not knowing, bearing witness, and taking action might already be alive in our own lives.
Right, not as something to adopt, but as something already happening, right where we are.
Many things come up, arise out of Zazen. Now, we do, in the Zen world, we do have you work on certain things like breathing or koan study, but eventually you do what's called shikantaza, just sitting, and that bearing witness to the wholeness of life. At any rate, I was just sitting, and what came up to me is an experience which I want to share. It's one of my first Zen experiences. It's before I had a teacher. I had already been to a Japanese Zen temple to do some meditation, but nobody spoke English, and I decided to just do meditation on my own, do Zazen on my own. I was about 20, and I didn't have much information or knowledge, but I sat. I did a lot of sitting, but I didn't have a teacher, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And one day I had an experience in which I felt I lost my mind. And it terrified me. And out of that experience, what came up was I quit Zazen. I quit for a year. I was so terrified by what had happened. That experience could have led me to stop doing Zazen forever. But I had read a book called Three Pillars of Zen, and then I saw an advertisement saying, yes, Tari Roshi was going to give a talk in Los Angeles. That's where I was living. And so I went to the talk. And at that talk, I met his translator. Yes, Tani Roshi did not speak English. His translator was a man named Maizumi, who then becomes my teacher. I went up to the translator, Turns out I had met the translator about 4 years before. But I said, do you have a group? And he says, I just opened up a place, and I started to study with him every day. So the result of that experience for me was the importance of having a teacher, which then got reinforced when I became my teacher's right-hand person in our Zen Center in Los Angeles. And many students would come who had no teacher and had been doing meditation for a long period. By then, many people knew about meditation, and they would do it on their own. And in many cases, they're perfectly okay. But many cases, the people that were on their own had damaged themselves. And if anybody in those days would say, can I study without a teacher? I would say, no. You're opening yourself for problems. All kinds of things can happen. There are many experiences that can arise out of meditation that can be traps. The main problem when it feels great is that you want to recreate it. I want to do that again, and you, if you're trying to do it through meditation, you try to get your meditation to do that, to recreate the experience you had. And that's bad news, man. It's bad news. Anyway, so that was the first experience that came out of bearing witness, out of sitting, and the fear that I'd lost my mind. So I was practicing with my teacher, Manzumi Roshi, and also that year, Kori Roshi, the man that Manzumi Roshi started to do his work with when he was at university, decided to come to the United States, to Los Angeles, and I decided that Manzumi Roshi was my teacher, my root teacher, but I decided to do sesshin with Kori Roshi. And Manzumi Roshi was translating. And during that sesshin, I passed the koan mu in a way that Kori Roshi and Manzumi Roshi thought was very unusual. Koan is something you contemplate on until you can present what the meaning, but not intellectual meaning. You can present it via expression, that you experience what it is. And working on koan mu is exactly like working on what is not knowing. The first tenet of our three tenets. Didn't know what was not knowing. So it was in the form of this word, no. I was bringing witness to that. And an experience came out in which I felt the unity of life. So the two big experience during those first 20 years was one, feeling I had gone crazy, and out of which came the feeling I have to have a teacher. And two, the experience of the unity of life in such a way that I felt that I could help people have that experience, and that the way that it was extremely important, most important thing in my life. So I quit my job, and that became my whole profession. So for that first 20 years, the practice in a way that I was involved with was all about me. And I was trying to have other people have the same experiences that I had had. And those experiences would be then all about them. It's an interesting 20 years of practice in which I feel that maybe 80% of the Zen groups around the world, that's what they're doing. And it was extremely important for me. But in my opinion, it's not the only way to practice. You and I and many people here practice Zen in a Japanese model. And that model is a very austere model. It really comes out of the Kamakura period, which is the samurai period in Japan. Shakyamuni Buddha did not practice that way. So it's not from that era. And one of the things that drew me to Zen is a lot of the stories of Chinese monks that were living in the mountains, and that was not their style. And then in 1976, on my way to work, I was in a car with 4 people driving to work. I had about an hour trip to go to work. And I had an experience of, which I've talked a lot about because it was so important in my life. It was an experience of feeling all the hungry spirits or ghosts in the universe, all suffering, as we all do. Everyone is suffering. And they were suffering for different things. Some were suffering because they didn't have enough enlightenment. Some were suffering because they didn't have enough food. Some were suffering because they didn't have enough love. Some were suffering because they didn't have enough fame. Some were suffering because they didn't have enough housing. All kinds of sufferings. And what came up immediately was a vow. So out of that, in this car ride to work, pops up this vision of all of these hungry spirits. And immediately it also popped up that those are all aspects of me. But remember, my experience was that everything is me. So whatever pops up, that's me. And that's all these hungry aspects of myself popped up. And an action came out of that, which was a vow to serve, to take care, to feed. It was really more to feed all these hungry spirits. So until then, I had decided that my work was going to be in the meditation hall and in a temple. And I was going to work only in the meditation hall and work only with people who came to our Zendo and Washington training. But now I made this vow to work with all these hungry spirits. So that meant I had to change the venue, change the place I worked. And now it was to work in the meditation hall, but also to work in all of life, all of society. And then the big question arose to me, what would be useful to help people in these different spheres of life, like business people and entertainment people and social action people and all these people? What would be good ways of helping people to experience the oneness of life in those spheres? So this was my new kind of study. What would be the methods? Also, for a number of years before 76, in our Zen Center, we had morning, afternoon liturgy, and evening liturgy. And it's sort of prescribed what that liturgy is in the Soto sect. But the evening service that we did was called Kanroman. And somehow that service really affected me. And I knew nothing about what it was about, because I was just chanting this Japanese words. We had many different liturgies that we chanted, but here's one that somehow had really attracted me without my knowing any of the words. Now, in Japan, that service was used particularly for all of the spirits that were being neglected for various reasons. So it could be that somebody died in a war, and in those days, a long time ago, it might take 30 years before the news came back that somebody had died. So that service was for all of those who had died and nobody knew about they had died. It was for like in our case in New York, for the homeless that nobody's taking care of. It's for all of those that are not being taken care of. And in a sense, for all of the parts of ourselves that aren't being taken care of, which leads to all these hungry spirits. Because it's such an important service for me, that has become, for a long time now, the main service of the Zen Peacemaker order. By 79, I was planning to leave the Zen Center in Los Angeles and move back to my original home, which was in New York. And I started to meet with people in the New York area to create a board and to plan where we would start and how it would be. First, building the spiritual base, and then the study base, and then the business base to give us resources, and then the social action base. And all along, I was looking, how does this work in terms of relationships? What we were doing, our meditations and koan study and different Zen studies and teaching people that, at the same time, we were trying to develop a work practice. What do you do in terms of work that would help the people who are working experience the unity of life? That was my question. So my question, as we started to work in these different fields, was not just how do we do a good job, or in social action, how do we help? My question was, how do we do it in a way that helps the people that are doing the work and the people that are being served? How do we do it in a way that helps both of them experience the oneness of life? That was always my question. And that question has never stopped. The word Buddha means to awaken, and awaken one. That awakening is called, in different languages, different terms. In English, it's called enlightenment. Japanese, it's called Kensho, which translates into English as the seeing of the nature. Every language has their. So, and then I always say, what? Awaken to what? Awaken to the unity of life. Awaken to the oneness of life. Awaken to the interconnectedness of life. So that's what Buddhism is about. That's what Buddhism is about. And there are just different techniques. To move is one technique to help people do that. In the Zen Peacemakers, our major way, besides meditation, is through social action, via the Three Tenets. Not just any kind of social action. It's got to be based on those Three Tenets. It is not just to make us feel better. One of the things that's interesting to me is in my early years, in the first 20 years, whenever I gave a talk, I was always giving talks. I'm a terrible writer. I can't write. But I can talk. And so many times people have to figure out how to shut me up. Once I start talking, so in those first 20 years, whenever I gave a talk, always there would be some people that would say, how do we bring this into our life? I understand about how you sit now, but how do I bring it into my life? Always I had the question. In the second 20 years, never heard that question. Because when people saw me talking, what they saw is somebody that was bringing it into his life. That's my feeling. Why that question never arose again after the first 20 years. So that's an important little piece of information. Because in the first 20 years, always we said, the practice has to be in your life. I mean, that's what my teacher said, my teacher's teachers. You know, I studied with Yasani, if you would call her, she would. They always said that. And people weren't seeing it because if they saw it, they wouldn't ask the question. But they kept asking the question, how do we bring it into our life? We started the business and we built first a bakery to make money. And as soon as we were okay financially, we started to expand what we were doing. And what I did is, I didn't have a plan as to what we would do. We built our bakery in a very poor part of town. And I listened to what was going on in that poor part of town. And it seemed like the biggest issue was homelessness and single-parent homelessness. There was crack violence everywhere on the street, so drugs was also big. So out of bearing witness to what was happening where we were, we started to do things. First, to feed people in the local soup kitchens. But then we started to build housing, permanent housing for people. But you couldn't give somebody an apartment that didn't have a job. They would lose the apartment. So at the same time, you were creating jobs. And if you're a single parent, you can't work, you couldn't get child care. So we had to build child care. And there was drugs everywhere, so we had to get involved in drugs. So we looked at the whole picture, essentially, again, bearing witness to what was going on. And out of that came this Grayson model. And this Grayson model was built on the Buddhist principle. How we did it, I mean, what we did came out in Three Tenets. But what comes out of that is, it's not the Zendo anymore. You're working in old society. I did not introduce any Buddhist notions to our staff. Most of the staff are people that either had been homeless, drug addicts, convicts. We hire them right off the street. We do no checking of their background. They have to work well. If they don't, their buddies fire them. We do not preach any Buddhist values, but the whole structure, the whole environment they're working in was informed, in my opinion, by our Buddhist values. So after a number of years, I felt it was time for me to move on. I'm a very unstable person. And when things become, well, anyway, I don't want to sidetrack. It became time to move on for me. And there were people I felt that could do a great job, maybe better. I'm good at initial vision. I'm not such a great administrator. So when things go into that phase where it has to be more operational, I'm not necessarily the best. So I decided to do something else, but I didn't know what. But I had the Three Tenets. So I said, what should I do next to work with people that are being rejected by society, and particularly AIDS, homeless, poverty? What should I do? It was my 55th birthday. And since it was my birthday, I invited people to join me in the sitting with that theme. We would sit on the steps of the Capitol of the United States in Washington, D.C. My birthday is January 18th, so it's very cold there. And it turned out to be the coldest week in 50 years in Washington, D.C. So we were covered with snow. And something arose out of that bearing witness. And what arose was the Zen Peacemaker Order. We talked about precepts for about a year, and those are now called the Zen Peacemaker Order precepts. And we have the Zen Peacemaker Order rule, which consists of the three treasures, Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, the three tenets, those 10 precepts, and 4 commitments that were proposed and developed during the World Congress of Religions, and we've adapted. So that was the beginning of the Zen Peacemaker Order. So I had a student, name is Claude Anchen Thomas, and when I met him, he had already been pretty heavily involved with Thich Nhat Hanh. He had been in the Vietnam War. He had had a mental breakdown. He was a very confused person, confused. He couldn't sleep at night, He'd be kept up by the bombs and all kinds of things. He had been a gunner on a helicopter, a tailgate gunner, shooting people. And then he had a nervous breakdown. At any rate, he came to me wanting to know if he could be my student. And for many different reasons, I agreed. And it turned out that he was soon going to join a bunch of Buddhist monks who chant the title Lotus Sutra. And they march and beat a drum and chant, and they walk. So they were planning a walk from Auschwitz to Hiroshima through all of the war-torn countries. And Anchen had decided to join them. So I said that I would go with him to Auschwitz and give him lay, what's called jukai. Jukai means taking the precepts as a lay person. And I would do that at Auschwitz, and then I would join for the last month of that walk and ordain him as a priest at the helicopter site where he was stationed in Vietnam. And it turned out there was an interfaith conference being held at Auschwitz in regards to this walk. And so different people were invited for this interfaith conference, and the group that was going to walk was sitting in Birkenau during the conference, and we were all wishing them well, and then they started their walk. So I decided to go to the interfaith conference. We went, and part of that workshop is they did a tour. And so in the tour, we entered Birkenau, and I was struck again, right before I was struck by all of the hungry spirits wanting to be fed or wanting their suffering to be relieved. So now I was struck by the feeling of souls. In my head, it was like millions of souls wanting to be remembered. And so again, this came out of my bearing witness to that place, this action of these souls arising, wanting to be remembered. And that set me on a path of designing a retreat that would work with that theme. It took about a year and a half to design the retreat. When I'm there, I always talk, for me, what the retreat is about, which has to do with remembering. See, in these souls, what's fascinating to me is that most people that come pick a few souls, maybe the Jewish souls. The Poles in the first retreat picked the Jewish and the Germans. They said, it's all about you guys. It's got nothing to do with us. Everybody in that is saying, this is what it's about. I'm saying it's about all. It's how we treat the other. I mean, that's where the handicapped were killed. That's where the gays were killed. That's where the gypsies were killed. That's where the Polish intellectuals were killed. That's where the Catholics were killed. That's where the Jews were killed. It's about a lot of people, man. And so for all those years, I was saying that, and then other people were writing, oh no, it's about the German Jewish thing. That's too narrow. Nothing is that narrow. That's our way of thinking. Narrow. It's like thinking that the Israel-Palestine thing is about the Israelis or the Palestine. It's not about either one. It's about, I could say, it's not even about the Middle East. It's about the whole gestalt of this interest net. And once we narrow it to one group, oh, it's what the Germans do, and then they feel guilty, and then, oh, it's about this. We lose the picture, man. It's a whole, you got to see the whole, I think, in my opinion. If you don't see the whole net, you'll go astray, and you'll cause more problems. That's my opinion. So I try to devise such a retreat that would come out of two things. A place. The place for me was Birkenau, and the theme was how we treat others. To see, but because I chose Birkenau, for most people the theme is the Holocaust. That's never been my theme, and I've said that each time. I keep repeating it just because it's so amazing to me. And in that retreat, we have spirit holders. And the role of the spirit holder is to stay tuned to the gestalt of the retreat. So when the spirit holder says we should tweak it, they should be tweaking it because it's getting away from the three tenets. Heinz was our spirit holder, and he introduced the thought of remembering the capos, the gods, and the SS that worked there. And what I was told is about half of the retreatants were going to leave. They were very, very upset at that notion. The notion that they should be remembered too. Because if you're talking about suffering, was it just the Jews that suffered then? That doesn't work that way. Just like now, every Israeli is in suffering. And if you step over to the West Bank, every Palestinian is in suffering. If you went into Gaza, everyone is suffering. And the soldiers, they're suffering. And they will continue suffering after it's all over. After it's all over, all these people are suffering. So, what's the deal? What ends the suffering? And so the next year, I made that the theme, and we did a lot of work on that. At any rate, the power of that bearing witness retreat at Auschwitz led me to make bearing witness retreats a major part of the work I do. So for me, the experience, and that's what Buddhism is about, is experiencing these things. And as Shakyamuni said, it's experiencing the interconnectedness of life, the oneness of life. So what are the tools to help us do that? Zazen is one. But for me, what I've seen in my experience is bearing witness stuff has done that much broader. And when I look at it in terms of my terminology of the last 20 years, it came essentially out of three tenets. So these are actions that arose out of bearing witness. And you'll see, I mean, and the not knowing was obvious. And in each case, they were bearing witness. And things arose, which then affected my life quite a bit. But the third tenet is taking action, the way we explicitly said it, taking action that arises out of not knowing and bearing witness. So the taking is very important. That is, do stop. Don't just sit in your cushion and say, oh, I had a great experience and that is that. No, do something with it. So now we want to encourage people to do things. And if they do, there'll be new seeds all over the place, and that will shed more light. And I think that's what we're doing is sort of more light is happening. And if it's healthy, then it grows. If it's not healthy, it'll die. So just because you do something based on three tenets, if it's not healthy, it's going to die. If it's helpful, I think it will live and grow.
What stays with me after listening to Bernie is how little of this work began with a strategy.
Action only came after spending real time with what was uncomfortable, unresolved, or unseen.
That feels important, especially in a culture that often pushes us to act before we've really listened.
Bernie's reflection reminds us that Buddhism isn't about escaping suffering.
It's about realizing the oneness of life, even when that oneness includes suffering.
And once that oneness is felt, taking action isn't something we have to force.
It's a natural response.
If this episode stirred something for you, we invite you to explore how this practice continues through Zen Peacemakers today.
You'll find information about our Bearing Witness retreats, our ongoing programs, and the Taking Action initiative in the show notes.
These are ways to engage with this practice in everyday life.
In your own hometown, with your own communities, and in your own way.
Thank you for taking the time to listen and for being part of this larger field of practice.
If this podcast is meaningful to you, please consider subscribing and supporting the work of Zen Peacemakers.
You can learn more at www.zenpeacemakers.org.
And we'll be back in 2 weeks with our next episode of the Peacemakers Podcast.
The Peacemakers Podcast is a production of Zen Peacemakers, an international organization whose mission is to realize our oneness and relieve suffering through contemplative social action.